In this second chapter, we're going to give you a brief overview of the history of psychopathology and introduce some concepts that will be important in later chapters. Our focus will be on introducing the scientific paradigms that now dominate the field of psychopathology, but also covering some of the history, including some rather embarrassing history about how people with psychopathology were considered and treated. We'll also talk about humanitarian reform, which is very important in our current understanding. And we'll introduce you to the two major approaches that still are important in this field. The organic view that holds that biological components contribute, and the psychological view that suggests that our experiences shape who we are, including our psychopathology. I want to start by introducing some terms. The first is paradigm. A paradigm is a framework in which we understand things. In science, we have many different paradigms, and the paradigms determine what variables we consider important and how we look at various phenomena. But there are paradigms that are not scientific as well. We'll see some examples of those. Paradigms have an enormous impact on how people view a phenomenon, as you will see shortly. Paradigms don't change easily. In fact, they change rather slowly, and usually only after it's very clear that the paradigm is no longer working. There's a fantastic monograph on that written by Thomas Kuhn that talks about paradigm shifts and the way they've happened in the fields of science. I also want to introduce the concept of models. We're going to use models a lot as we talk about various psychopathologies. Models are simplified representations of reality. Okay, they don't show everything. They just show the things that are relevant. And one way of understanding them is they're like maps. If you want to drive from one place to another, of course, now we would use GPS, but previously we would look at a map and we would see which roads will get us there. If you want to walk through a park, you will likely have a map that will show, among other things, pathways and elevations so that you know whether you are climbing or walking on level ground. If you're an engineer and you need to do some work under the streets, there are maps that show what is already under the streets so that you don't cut into a power line or a gas line or a sewer line in your excavation. Maps don't show everything. They show what is relevant to your purpose. So when we talk about, say, a behavioral model of psychopathology, we're going to focus on behavior. If we show a genetic model of psychopathology, we're going to focus on genes and how those genes interact with the environment. Let's start with the ancient views of psychopathology. The skull that you see here dates back roughly 10,000 years. You may notice something interesting about the skull. It has a couple of holes that aren't normally in a skull. We believe those holes, although we can't be entirely certain, but we believe that those holes are part of a process called trephining. Trephining was a way to release the bad spirits, the devil that inhabited the person and caused psychopathology. Now this goes back 10,000 years, so how did they create those holes? They held the patient down and they took a sharp rock and they pushed that rock as hard as they could into the skull and twisted it, grinding away the skull and the skin, etc. Remember, there was at that time no anesthesia of any sort. The person was probably screaming. And why would they do that? Because their paradigm Remember, paradigms have enormous impact. Their paradigm was that craziness, psychopathology, was the result of being inhabited by the devil, and you had to give the devil a way of escaping from that person. So you cause that person unbelievable pain in the name of curing them. Now, did it work? I doubt it. But of course, we don't have any studies from then. But if you look very closely at the skull, one of the things you'll notice is that one of those holes was cut earlier than the other and shows more signs of healing. So the person survived the first one, maybe even the second one, because there appears to be healing there. Did they get any better? I don't know. The fact that there were two suggests that there were still problems even after they had done one. The ancient view focused on the devil as evil and psychopathology as evil, so the two were treated as one. And that meant that when you tried to treat psychopathology, you needed to use procedures to expel the devil. Again, the paradigm dictates almost everything. Now, I wish I could tell you that the idea of demonic possession goes back before recorded history. But in fact, we have a lot of recorded history that shows that it continued for a very long period of time in several different parts of the planet. Well into the 14th and 15th century in Europe, demonic possession was a dominant idea of the cause of psychopathology and also other illnesses. Even in the United States, the Salem witch trials were an example of demonic possession as being the explanation for psychological disorders. Now, there was, in fact, a formal book. It translates from the Latin to mean roughly the witch's hammer. That was the guideline for how to diagnose and treat psychopathology. Of course, they called it demonic possession. For example, if you thought someone was a witch or a warlock, which meant that they were possessed by the devil, what you would do is you would tie heavy rocks to them and throw them in a deep pond or river. If they managed to somehow stay alive, to stay above the surface and not drown, the only way they could do that is with the help of the devil, in which case you would move on to the treatment. The treatment at the time was burning the person alive at the stake. If you were even accused of being possessed, and often that was a result of unusual, what we might call crazy behavior, the diagnosis was as bad as the treatment, although probably a little less painful. You ended up dead either way. Again, a paradigm, no matter how bad it is, a paradigm determines everything. Although demonic possession as a paradigm existed for a very long time, there have been periods in which some people had some enlightened views. The early Greeks, for example, going back roughly 2,500 years, believed that there were natural reasons for both illness and psychopathology. And they talked about the balance of humors, yellow, black bile, blood, and phlegm. That balance today we would call homeostasis, and we're well aware that the health of our body often is a result of the homeostasis working the way it's supposed to. Now, it turns out this particular model was flat out wrong, but that's not surprising because the early Greeks knew almost nothing about the physiology of the body. But the fact that they were thinking in terms of physical causes that could, in theory, be studied and manipulated was a huge step forward from the idea of demonic possession. I wish I could tell you that the supernatural traditions are now dead and gone and that they've been entirely replaced by scientific traditions, but that's not true. Mass hysteria has been documented up until recent times, including mob psychology, which is a form of mass hysteria. There are people that believe that our stars, under which we were born, affect who we will be, our personality, and our entire life, and that the phases of the moon has a huge impact. In fact, the word lunacy, moon is referred to as a lunar orbit, comes from that idea. There's actually pretty strong evidence to show that there's no valid relationship between the stars or the moon and human behavior. But that doesn't stop people from believing it. Many people would not go about their day without reading their morning horoscope. Now, not all of the history of psychopathology was as negative as burning people at the stake because they were believed to be possessed. There were people who recognized that people with severe psychopathology needed help, and they provided places to help them, called asylums. Now, the word asylum literally means a safe place. And initially, these, in fact, were safe places. Often they were monasteries where monks provided the care that was needed for those who needed that care. And they did a good job for a while until, because there was such a great need, they became so overcrowded and the resources, the number of people, were simply not adequate to the task of taking care of people. Now remember, at the time, there was no treatment. So all you could do was sort of take care of the people. You couldn't help them to get better and go on their own. As the asylums became increasingly overcrowded and miserable places to live, new asylums were constructed, and sometimes the new asylums, although they provided space for people to be cared for, really did nothing to honor the humanity of the individuals under treatment. It was very common to build asylums with viewing areas where people would get in a carriage on a Sunday and go out and pay money, which was used to feed the people in the asylums, to watch the crazy people be crazy. Obviously, that is not recognizing the humanity of the individuals. Now, there were several people, I'm not going to go into detail, who fought this, who argued for treating people humanely and with respect. Pinnell, Tuke, Dix, each in their own countries, made major progress in terms of increasing guilt that people were treated so badly and getting people to consider ways of treating them better. When we talk about the organic perspective, what we're saying is that we believe that there are biological processes, either understood or not understood, that are the reasons behind psychological disorders. We learned earlier that the ancient Greeks believed in that, although their theories were primitive and incorrect, but they were the first organic views of psychopathology and medicine. René Descartes also contributed to the idea of a biological process as part of his mind-body dualism. The body being the physiology and the mind being that process that goes beyond the physiology. But the best evidence for organic factors as a cause of psychopathology was a disorder that unfortunately still exists, even though there's no reason that it should, because it's easily treatable. If you get the venereal disease, syphilis, you will be very uncomfortable and you will be contagious. You can pass it on to other people whenever you're having sex with them. But the disease looks like it goes away by itself, much like other diseases like measles and the mumps. But it doesn't actually go away. It goes dormant for a while. And about 25 years later, the spirochete, which is the organism that causes syphilis, becomes active again and starts destroying brain tissue. Once that process starts, you start seeing psychotic symptoms that are almost indistinguishable from schizophrenia. And in time, you will see more severe physical symptoms, including paralysis. Now, that's a clear example of a biological condition that leads to psychological disorder, in this case, eventually death. Now, it doesn't prove that all disorders are biological, but what it shows is that it is possible to get a psychological disorder from a biological abnormality. Perhaps one of the most important people in modern psychiatry to view the organic perspective as being important was Emil Kraepelin. He identified a group of individuals. He gave them the diagnosis of dementia praecox in the late or early 1880s. He argued that these individuals had a psychological disorder that was a result of biological abnormalities of the brain. Dementia, Alzheimer's, for example, is a form of dementia. Praecox translates into early. He essentially said these people are showing an early dementia in their 20s instead of their 70s. That's progressive and the result of brain damage. Now, at the time, he didn't have the tools to be able to know whether that was correct, but it turns out he was correct. By the way, we currently call dementia praecox schizophrenia. That was a term that was introduced about 30 years later by Eugen Bleuler. Bleuler argued that Kraepelin was too pessimistic, that in fact, this was not a progressive brain disease in all cases, but could be for some. And he used a bit broader criteria. Now, it turns out that Kraepelin was correct, but schizophrenia seemed to be a better term, so that's the term that we still use. But the diagnostic criteria that we use for schizophrenia is much closer to what Emil Kraepelin suggested 140 years ago than what Bleuler suggested 110 years ago. Understanding that there may be biological causes does not necessarily mean that you can develop effective biological treatments, and many of our early biological treatments turned out to not be very effective. Some, like shock therapy, which we'll talk about when we get to mood disorders later on, does work, and in fact is still used, although not terribly often. Others, like brain surgery, the lobotomy, for example, never worked very well. But for a long time we thought that it might, and that's partly because of a concept we talked about in chapter 1 called expectations. When we expect something to work, we tend to notice the little pieces of evidence that suggest that it's working, and we tend not to notice the pieces of evidence suggesting that it does not. We don't do lobotomies anymore. We haven't done lobotomies for 60 or 70 years, and I hope we never do. We do occasionally do brain surgery, but it's far more sophisticated and more rational and more effective than the lobotomies. But what changed everything was the development of drugs. The first drugs developed in the early 1950s treated severe psychological disorders such as schizophrenia. Since then, we've developed dozens of drugs to treat dozens of disorders. Some of those drugs seem to be effective for many different disorders. Drug therapy is the primary biological treatment, although it is not the only biological treatment we use today. To give you an idea of how important drug therapy is, Around 1950, about 550,000 hospital beds in the United States were occupied by people who had the diagnosis of schizophrenia. In 1950, we had no treatment that was effective for schizophrenia, but in 1953, we discovered a class of drugs, phenothiazines, that did seem to reduce the symptoms, and fewer people needed to be hospitalized. Prior to that, most people with schizophrenia were diagnosed somewhere between the ages of, say, 18 and 28. And then they spent the rest of their lives in a psychiatric hospital. And they had a normal life expectancy. So they lived for 40 or 50 or 60 years in a psychiatric hospital. More than half of all the hospital beds, and I mean all the hospital beds, people that were in for appendicitis or cancer or a broken leg, were occupied by people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. But you'll notice in the graph that the numbers just kept dropping. And they were down, well, actually the number right now is around 30,000. And in that 70 years, or roughly 70 years since the introduction of phenothiazines, the population has tripled in size. So we've cut by 95% the number of hospital beds that are needed to treat people with schizophrenia, even as the population tripled. We have drugs for a variety of other disorders as well. We're going to be talking about those as we go through the disorders in later chapters.